All right, this story takes place at a boarding school in New England. The school was prestigious but very old, with a lot of strange traditions and even stranger rules. The students had always heard rumors about a certain room on the top floor of the dorm building that was permanently locked. No one knew what was inside or why it was locked, but over the years, stories had spread. Some said it used to be a storage room. Others claimed someone had died in there decades ago. Either way, it was the kind of thing that kept you up at night wondering. My friend Jake was the type who couldn't resist a good mystery. He was daring and always looking for an adventure, so when he heard about the locked room, he was obsessed. He wanted to find a way inside, even though the teachers strictly forbade any student from going up to the top floor after dark. He convinced me and two other friends, Tom and Lucas, to sneak up with him one night to check it out. So, on a Friday night after curfew, we waited until the building was silent. Then we crept out of our room, careful not to make any noise as we climbed the stairs to the top floor. The air up there was cold, colder than the rest of the dorm. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. At the end of the hall was the door, the locked room. Just standing in front of it felt wrong, like we were intruding somewhere we didn't belong. Jake tried the door, even though we all knew it would be locked. It didn't budge, but he'd come prepared. He pulled a small set of tools out of his pocket and started to pick the lock. None of us said a word. We were all too tense, watching the hallway in case a teacher walked by. After a few minutes, there was a soft click, and Jake grinned. He'd done it. He pushed the door open and we all peered inside. The room was pitch dark, with a faint smell of dampness and dust. Jake stepped in first, using his phone's flashlight to light the way. The rest of us followed, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The room looked like it had been abandoned for years. There were old wooden desks stacked in one corner, a couple of broken chairs, and an old chalkboard leaning against the wall. But the thing that struck me the most was the writing on the walls. They were covered in messages, scratched and scribbled into the plaster with something sharp. Most of them were just words like help and get out. But one phrase kept repeating, "They see you." Suddenly, Lucas gasped and pointed at the corner of the room. There was a chair facing the wall with a mirror propped up in front of it. The mirror was old and covered in dust, but we could just make out our reflections in it. It felt like we were being watched even though there was no one else there. Then, the door slammed shut behind us. We all jumped and Jake rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside, even though there was no one out there. Tom started pounding on the door, calling for help, but it was like the sound was swallowed up by the walls. The room felt like it was getting smaller, the air thicker. The shadows in the mirror seemed to move, even though we were all standing still. And then, we heard it, a faint whisper coming from the walls. It was hard to make out, but it sounded like someone repeating that same phrase, "They see you, they see you." The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from every corner of the room. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door flew open, and we tumbled out, gasping for air. We didn't look back. We ran down the stairs and didn't stop until we were back in our room, slamming the door behind us. The next morning, we told ourselves it was all in our heads, that we'd let our imaginations get the best of us. But later that day, we overheard a teacher talking to another staff member about the locked room. They said it used to be a study room until a student went missing in there years ago. His body was never found, but his belongings were discovered in that room. After that night, none of us ever went back to the top floor. The memory of that whisper still gives me chills, and I know, deep down, that whatever was in that room that night, it wasn't just our imaginations. This all happened during my junior year at boarding school. I was new to the place, still finding my way around and figuring out the rules. The school itself was ancient, with tall, imposing buildings, creaky floors, and long hallways that always seemed a little too dark, even during the day. People said it was haunted, but I figured they were just trying to scare the newcomers. One night, I stayed up late in the library finishing up a paper. By the time I was done, it was well past curfew. I didn't want to get caught, so I started sneaking my way back to the dorms, keeping to the shadows and staying quiet. As I passed by the headmaster's office, though, I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It sounded like someone was gently knocking on a wooden door, but there was no one around. I figured it was just the old building settling, so I hurried on. The next morning, I mentioned it to my roommate Sarah as a casual, "This creepy thing happened last night" story. But as soon as I brought it up, her face turned pale. She looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in and whispered, "Rachel, you shouldn't have heard that." She told me there was a story about the headmaster's office, a legend that every year, a student hears tapping by his door, and it's supposedly a sign that something bad is about to happen. I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to mess with me, but she seemed genuinely worried and told me to be careful. A few nights later, I was up late again, this time in my dorm room, studying. Around 2 a.m., I started to feel uneasy. The room was silent, but I had that weird sensation you get when someone's watching you. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away, and then I heard it. The same faint tapping sound just outside our door. Sarah heard it too. She shot me a look, terrified, and whispered, "Don't answer it." The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, growing slightly louder each time. I could barely breathe as we sat there listening. After what felt like forever, it finally stopped. We waited a few minutes before Sarah tiptoed over to the door to look through the peephole. She gasped and stumbled back. There's no one there," she whispered. The next morning we were both rattled, but we didn't talk about it again. I tried to focus on school and ignore the incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, like an unseen presence was lurking nearby. Then a week later, we found out that a student from the dorm next to ours had gone missing. They found her a few days later, deep in the woods behind the school, with no explanation as to how she got there. After that, I kept my head down and followed every rule to the letter. I didn't want to draw any more attention, especially not from whatever was haunting the headmaster's office. And to this day, I'll never forget that tapping sound. All right, so this story happened a few years back at an all-boys boarding school in upstate New York. The building was old, dating back to the early 1900s, with long hallways and creaky floors that seemed to echo with the footsteps of everyone who had walked through there over the decades. It was known for its academic excellence and strict rules, but as we'd soon learn, those weren't the only things the school was known for. I had just transferred in for my sophomore year, and honestly, I was nervous. Moving away from home wasn't easy, but I was also excited for a fresh start. My roommate, Mark, had been there since freshman year, and he was the one who first warned me about the shadow. He told me it was a rumor that everyone at the school knew about, a dark figure that appeared in one particular hallway late at night. Most people thought it was just a story to scare new students, but some swore they had seen it. One night, about a month into the semester, Mark and I were up late, working on a group project. We'd stayed in the common area after curfew and decided to sneak back to our room through that same infamous hallway. It was quiet, just the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards as we tiptoed past. As we walked, Mark suddenly stopped and grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing down the hallway. At first I didn't notice anything, but then, in the dim light, I saw it. A tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly still at the far end of the hall. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, like it was waiting. I felt my heart pounding as Mark and I stared, unable to look away. Then, almost in slow motion, the shadow started to move toward us. It was silent, gliding down the hallway without a single footstep. We were frozen, too scared to move or even breathe. The shadow came closer and closer, and as it did, the air around us grew colder. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Just when it seemed like the shadow would reach us, the hallway lights flickered on. In a flash, the shadow was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Mark and I looked at each other, both pale and shaken. We bolted to our room, locked the door, and didn't speak for the rest of the night. The next morning, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light or just our imaginations. But from that night on, we took the long way back to our dorm, avoiding that hallway whenever we could. Some of the other students told us they'd seen it too, this shadowy figure that haunted the halls. And each story was eerily similar, describing the same dark, silent figure that seemed to glide, always appearing late at night as if guarding something we weren't meant to see.